Look, it seems to me that the left-hand side of Karen's chart is relatively straightforward. A good disaster really makes the case for climate-compatible development. We've seen that in many of our countries, El Salvador, Colombia, as Claudia said, many others. It's about jobs, it's about future jobs and competitive advantage in an economy, global economy, which is changing very fast. It's about foreign policy and energy and natural resource security. You can make that case, you know, with enthusiasm and passion and with data, but then when you turn around, all these obstacles are staring you in the face. Some of them are conceptual, as Emma has suggested. Some of them are financial, because actually it's all about the discount rate, as Claudia and Karen have both suggested, short-term pain for long-term benefit. And some of them are just about interests and about how you manage the losers and how you manage compensation. Many of you in the room and listening overseas, outside, have really good practical experience on the ground, and I would love to have some contributions around, yes, what the drivers are, but also what you've done or what you've seen happen that really deals with the constraints and makes climate-compatible development, tests it, if you like. Not to say makes it happen, whether it's a good idea or not, but tests it. So I'd rather you didn't ask questions. I'd rather you said something interesting to contribute to the conversation, either with an example or a story or some challenge that you have dealt with. And the rules are these. Please, if you're outside the room, send us a message and it will appear on my screen. If you're in the room, that's you, please stand up, say who you are, speak into the microphone because otherwise the sound doesn't carry. Say something short, sharp and interesting and sit down again. So those are the rules. I'll start in the room while I'm waiting for some things to come from outside. Who'd like to go first? Malcolm's got a mic.
Are some natural scientists here? Of course, social scientists contribute, add to that.
Will you say who you are?
Yes, I'm from Women for Peace and Justice in Sri Lanka. Matter is only a limited so much in the planet. It can be changed from one form to the other, but it cannot be created or destroyed. If you bear that in mind, we are all the time changing or converting oxygen into carbon dioxide. And nobody talks about the amount of carbon dioxide generated by holiday flights, and which is being promoted. Oh, go on, promote it. And I can say that. Now, David Cameron has promised, Sri Lanka has a sort of made him promise issue of what is these Rolls-Royce engines for planes to make him forego human rights and to make him attend Chogum there. That is another question. And I am very much in agreement with you, because in Sri Lanka, as in many other tropical countries, land from the poor are grabbed by oppressive governments to promote tourism, and that is happening right now in many places.
Okay, thanks so much. I mean, there are two very good points there, actually. If you were David Cameron, would you be trying to sell Rolls-Royce engines even though you might worry about the climate impact? And who controls resources on the beach? We're going to pick up a series of comments and we'll come back to you on the panel in a second. Who else would like to come in? Please, Natasha.
Thanks very much. Is this working? Can you pick it up if I can? I'll just speak. Okay. Natasha Grist from ODI, working on climate smart agriculture. Two sort of stories, really, from experiences I've had in the last few months. CDKN funded project working in Senegal with Humanitarian Futures Programme. A very clear example of how a flooding disasters led to government ministries being very interested in working on climate risk and decision making, and have worked very closely with Met offices, with government, with local communities to really understand what's happening in terms of local, very short-term to longer-term forecasting, and getting that information out to communities this is not entirely climate compatible development. We don't have a mitigation aspect here. But I think what we see here is that learning this lesson from this is that a very clear driver is essential in order to get the backing that is needed from government and from communities to see that we really need to move now on these issues. And I think there's a challenge here for the green growth agenda in terms of how do we get government and the institutional change that is required at the speed that is required to effect this climate compatible development. A similar example from the Accra project, which I was working recently in Mozambique, Africa Climate Change Resilience Alliance. And again, we've been working at the local level with decision makers based on a very recent 3-month very serious flooding event, a number of tens of people killed and many thousands displaced to refugee camps. I've never seen local government decision makers more excited about the idea of working on climate compatible futures and changing the planning processes that they have. And I think that we need to think about how can we make this real energy come towards the green growth sector in the same way. And I'd like to hear if there have been examples from Ethiopia and other countries which have really taken this forward at government level, to hear how that has happened and how we affect this institutional change.
Natasha, on Emma's point about losers and costs of moving in this direction, when you looked at the Senegal and Mozambique example, climate smart agriculture, is it a win-win? Are the losers, how do the losers get compensated?
It's a good question. In both of those cases, there are clear winners, and actually the losers are not there because they're not working on mitigations, they're not losing land areas to different methods of production. But if you look down the longer term, when they're looking at bringing in different crops to perhaps make those communities more resilient to the variations of climate over time, then there would be losers in terms of there'd be some yields which would be decreased certain years because of the wider variation of crops that are needed to be grown in certain land areas. But that's because this project is just in its second year now, they haven't quite got to that stage. So they've gained the trust with the local communities, and the next stage after that is to bring in ideas of longer term climate change and then bring in ideas about what do you need in terms of your livelihood on farm and off farm to increase resilience in those communities.
And what would you say to somebody whose land is seized or taken for mangrove swamp replanting? For example, mangrove replanting, never mind the swamp bit.
Well, I think that there are lots of people who are looking into compensation for these issues, but what I would say is that that's not really looking at the anthropological and the personal perspectives around these land areas, and we see people talking about the economic costs involved but not really understanding the social and psychological impacts of this for communities. So I don't think I've seen enough evidence on that.
Thanks so much. I've got 2 or 3 other hands up. Let's just keep talking for a bit and you'll have plenty of time to come back. Tom, and then we'll come across to the centre and then we'll come back to the panel.
Hi, Tom Mitchell. I head the climate change programme at ODI and also the climate smart disaster risk management outcome within CDKN. Just, as Emma, as one of the kind of supposed architects of climate compatible development within the context of CDKN, I suppose I have some kind of defence to make in some senses against the challenges that you present. I think the first to say is that climate compatible development isn't a solution for poor development. We've got to recognise that the development bubble there needs to be good development, it needs to be inclusive development, it needs to be pro-poor development. And all the things that we know can go wrong in development processes can still go wrong in the context of climate compatible development. We need to work just as hard on them. I think in that respect we are cognizant around the world of where particularly green growth policies are being used to advance political futures in a way that we would not want to see, through land grabs, through essentially mistreatment of poor people to advance gains with the kind of short-term rent seeking. So I don't think in that regard that we should necessarily question particularly the concept without really thinking about what we mean by good development, and it doesn't kind of forego any sense of trying to understand what makes good development. I think the second thing to say is that, I think when Simon and I were kind of drafting the paper in that particular regard, we weren't particularly thinking about a kind of a projectized approach to climate compatible development. It wasn't about necessarily every project that government or needed to put in place needed to achieve triple wins. It was essentially about a kind of portfolio-based strategy. It was about government leadership across the entire suite of policies, investments and economy to achieve climate compatible development, which in many of those kind of outer spheres is actually about doing no harm to the other areas. It's about pursuing development policies in some settings that don't greatly increase carbon emissions, it not necessarily having the kind of the decrease element at its heart. I think the final point about costs is saying that, I think we're aware that in many adaptation interventions in particular, planned adaptation interventions, there are losers and there are regrets. The idea of no regrets adaptation, I think, has begun to dissipate a little bit. There are always some degree of regrets because you have the discount rates dimension. And so what we've probably got to do is to be sympathetic to the idea that we've got to really understand costs over time, and we've got to understand benefits over time. And in any way, there's lots of different approaches that we take that involve making significant investments where we don't necessarily know the actual outcome. The problem that we have in this particular area is we can't wait to really understand the outcomes of adaptation processes. We've got to actually take a punt and experiment and do what we know we think is right, and recognise that we've got to appreciate the kind of costs and benefits over time.
Thanks so much. I'm going to take two more. You were first, I think, and this lady here. We'll come back to you later on, but you had your hand up first, I think. There's a microphone coming.
Thank you. Peter Baker from CABI. Just picking up...
Stand up so people can see you.
Sorry, yes. Picking up Claudia Martinez's... she was mentioning coffee. There's two sides to that question. There's this emerging story of coffee as very sustainable, that there are all sorts of projects going on. Carbon neutral coffees are starting to come out. In fact, if you really start to work out the amount of carbon sequestered by many of those projects, it's very tiny. The other side of the of the coin is that there's considerable deforestation going on around the world to grow more coffee, because coffee is expanding by 1% to 2% a year. There's deforestation in Colombia. There's massive deforestation now in Peru. There's exponential increase in production of coffee in Peru and in Honduras as well. So I'm sorry, but I'm very, very skeptical about when Claudia talks about how Colombia has managed to sort of square this circle and that the coffee there is CCD.
I mean, the issue around coffee, as much as anything else, is that it's highly susceptible to an increase in temperature, and therefore will have to shift up the altitude gradient.
Exactly.
And that question about whether or not it remains a feasible product in countries where there is temperature rise.
Well, we're talking about this in... I was just at the Rust meeting in Guatemala, and it's a big issue there now. And certainly in Colombia, the lower coffee has now disappeared and is going to pasture, which has got a much lower carbon level. The main problem, the real problem at the moment, is lack of data. Nobody is really measuring the flux of the coffee lands, how much land is coming in, how much is going out, and what the total global carbon picture of coffee is. It's getting worse every year, I'm almost certain, but I can't prove it.
But if you were a coffee planner in Colombia, you would want to know what was likely to happen, and you'd want to try and sustain an industry which employs millions and generates foreign exchange on a huge scale.
Yes, but I think in the case of Colombia, it's getting increasingly hopeless because of the exchange rates are wrong, labor costs are high, the weather's terrible. They need a plan B there, and they don't have one.
Okay, thanks so much. The lady here.
Thank you very much. This is Rabia Zafar from Imperial College London, Art Sciences Department. My question is actually, when I was reading this working paper last night, I was trying to think about a case study in which we can apply this climate compatible development drivers and challenges. And I was literally thinking about the disaster risk reduction. Whether a disaster, it could be a man-made disaster or natural disaster. And recently, if you can take the the case of Bangladesh factory collapse, how do you address that sort of disaster in this context of climate compatible development? It's just a question not only for a few, but all the members here. It actually, what has happened is that the economy and the growth and the development and whatever the factory is actually giving us in this developed country and in that underdeveloped country, it's a big question under the heading of climate compatible development. Secondly, the question is, basically I'm from Pakistan, and I feel that I have been to Vietnam to attend the community-based adaptation conference, and I just felt that everything done is everything that has been doing is for adaptation. But since I came here and started studying in Imperial College London, I just came to know that there is more emphasis on mitigation. So is this a general case or idea that adaptation is for underdeveloped countries and mitigation is for developed countries? So how could climate compatible development would address these sort of issues?
Okay, those are two good questions. Thank you. I want to try and structure this a little bit. Karen and Emma and Claudia and others, can we start out with this Boeing engines issue, which is that you have an economy which is producing stuff and selling stuff and trading and employing people, and you're saying to countries, actually, you shouldn't be doing that at all, you should be doing windmills or something. And there are huge issues about transition, and there are big questions about how your industrial policy should manage that. And if you were Obama or David Cameron or anybody else, how would you manage this, and how is it something that is actually just very costly to do? And Karen, you might want to comment. I wonder whether Alberto would like to say something as well, and then we'll give you a chance on that as well. And then I want to come after that to this question of trade-offs and winners and losers. And Emma, perhaps you'd lead on that one in a second.
Okay, thank you. Yeah. So just to come back to your Obama question, if you wanted me to give him a point that would link directly to the USA's economic self-interest, then you would say that if you don't take into account these issues, the USA will get left behind because it's got all this cheap energy that it's going to use profligately probably, and going to continue in a growth trajectory that uses a lot of energy, whereas other countries which have a much more serious problem of access to energy are innovating a lot to solve that problem, to develop alternative sources of energy, to develop energy efficient methods of production. Over time, that will give them an enormous competitive advantage vis-a-vis the USA, but it's still over time, and so that's a long-term issue. If he's willing to take it on, then he should, because that would stand the USA in much better stead for the future. But it's a long-term time horizon.
Do you have a view just on the sort of the Nick Stern zero discount rate issue?
I think, yeah. I mean, the discount rate is a hugely problematic issue because it's not obvious that society values the future enough as a society. So you need real leaders who are willing to show that they are thinking ahead of the game, ahead of society in terms of driving that forward. And in developing countries, it's even harder to do that as they are facing, underdevelopment, and they have a strong case to ignore the future when they've just got to try and match the kinds of development levels that we've had for a long time.
I mean, I don't doubt for a minute you're right, but it's a slightly disappointing answer, because I would love you to say, Korea, Denmark, maybe some other countries, there are real short-term advantages. Look at the way China has developed a solar industry. We can actually create jobs very fast, very quickly, and you don't have to worry about the future so much because it's now. But perhaps I'll call on Alberto to say something about that, because you might be able to cheer us up.
Sorry, I will just need to have my thoughts a sec. Basically, if we wanted to say it from the developing country point of view, yeah, there's advantages, leapfrogging, blah de blah, energy efficiency and all that. So there's clear gains on that side. From a high income point of view, the advantages are going to be marginal, but they will be there in the long term. I mean, where there's already high employment, you can just shift it somewhere else. You're still going to need to create the skills, which is going to take time to go into green growth. But if you are, for example, if you're Obama, you're thinking, yeah, how am I going to compete with China? They can do that. They've got the scales, the labor, the manufacturing process to say, yeah, we can go against China to produce green tech. If you're David Cameron, how you say, should I enter this kind of market? No, there's no point, absolutely, for you, because whereas there will be benefits within the UK for using these technologies, in terms of manufacturing, you're so far behind in normal manufacturing, let alone green manufacturing, that perhaps in your mind it's not worth it. On the other hand, as I was saying earlier when we were having the meeting, the UK does have an advantage in its value added for manufacturing. So there is a place for it to put components together to undertake R&D for these kind of things, where, yes, there is a possibility for developing countries to engage in the process and create jobs, but it has to be at the upper end of the value chain. And if they don't do it now, there's no point, because China is going to enter its Japan phase soon, and it's going to start innovating itself rather than just copying and improving. It'll just start innovating, and even at that point, there'll be no point even joining the chain, because it'll be too late. So they have to do it now, or it's a bit kind of late to do that.
And do you have a view on the discount rate?
More or less the same as Karen's, more up to there.
Okay, I found myself challenged by these responses. I mean, you've given us a ray of light for developing countries, technological leapfrogging. How do others feel about this? That actually, unless you believe there is a zero discount rate, this is a big ask to move into new technologies and green growth? Yes, please. Can we have a microphone at the front here?
Andrew Ross from Global Garden. I'd like to answer that directly and also pick up on Karen's initial observations on the new economic opportunities here. You mentioned carbon finance and the failure in the carbon market to address this issue. I think there's a very important role for CDKN here in bringing new knowledge to bear in the way that natural capital can be valued, because this is underpinning the entire ecosystem equation. And in that context, I think there are big opportunities, because the private sector, the big multinationals, have all realized they have enormous supply chain costs. They are risking their whole businesses now, which are wholly dependent on water and energy, which is being lost through deforestation and soil erosion and other misuses of land. Now that has got a real market value. And in that context, the way that natural capital can be valued is something that can be transposed over into the bond market. And the launch of a bond in this area, tapping into a $99 trillion business, would be a really very beneficial new economic invention here. And the way in which natural capital is being developed as a methodology in the UK with the Natural Capital Committee under Professor Dieter Helm, and with the backing of DFID and DEFRA and DEC, we're seeing the emerging mechanism to understand how to value ecosystems and in particular biodiversity. I would suggest there's a really very good role for CDKN here to step in to the big scale economics and begin to convince the bond market that there is something seriously to be done here, which the carbon market failure quite evidently is showing there's a market failure and therefore a gap in the market.
Okay, that's very helpful. Thank you. Anybody else want to be optimistic? Yes, at the end on the right.
Thank you. Michael Grubb, Cambridge University.
Can you stand up, Michael, please, so people can see you?
Yes, I was listening with interest to that exchange and your slight sense of frustration, Simon. I mean, I'd echo the previous comment. I think the natural capital area is interesting. Whether or not one needs to go quite that far in terms of bond market, the role that plays. In terms, I can't really speak to the adaptation side of it, but in terms of energy sector mitigation, it seems to me that there is a simpler step and set of arguments before one has to get into that, which is that most of these countries are anyway having to invest very heavily in one direction or another in energy development, which is placing bets of one sort or another. And the choice is partly a balance between a bit more capital investment in stuff that may be more indigenous, maybe more reliant on renewables, or more fuel dependency of something which involves perhaps slightly lower capital investment but leaves one much more exposed to the international fossil fuel markets. Now, that's not a simple question of do you have a high or a low discount rate. It's a question of what kind of risks do you want to face over the next couple of decades, knowing all the uncertainties around fossil fuel markets. And so I think there's a perfectly legitimate alignment between some of the concerns about energy security and some of the concerns about climate change. At least for most importers, which the majority of developing countries are, there's a strong case of alignment interests there.
All right, thank you. I think probably we should move on from this, but I want to just leave us with a note that this is something we need a very clear line on, one way or the other. I suppose I would like it if the line was, this is a really good economic opportunity for the kind of reasons that Alberto suggested and Michael's just added to. You should do this because it's in your own short-term interest. But if we can't do that, then we probably need to think about other arguments. I'll come to you in just a second before I move on to the other question. I know that when the World Bank did the green growth paper, they struggled a lot inside the bank to make the case for green growth. There's quite a lot of good material in there, and I recommend that paper as a way of kind of framing the debate as well. Let's give you a quick, are you on that topic? A quick word on that, or are we going to move on to something else?
Obama's question.
I'll hold you to the end then, because I want to just come to this winners and losers issue first. Emma, Tom kind of gave a response, and a number of other people commented, Natasha too, that A, there may not always be losers as well as winners, and B, one shouldn't think too locally. I'm an economist, so I tend to think about Pareto optimality, which really leads you to think about compensation mechanisms. How do you respond to those comments people have made?
Okay, I would like to respond at two levels. One is the local level, where we might find initiatives, activities, projects, policies or government goals actually being implemented sort of by individuals on the ground. And secondly, perhaps a larger global issue about trade-offs and winners and losers, addressing this lady's comment as well. First of all, I think that actually, let me start at the global level because that point's closer to hand. I was thinking when you mentioned about the Bangladesh factory collapse, what should you do? And you think, well, okay, let's imagine that was in the UK. What would we do? We would reinforce our building code and make sure that we're enforcing our building laws. We would make sure so that would be our development contribution. Our adaptation contribution would be we'd make sure the building was adequately ventilated and insulated to cope with higher temperatures. We'd probably develop it with solar panels on the roof to make sure that it was a low energy building. And when we say this in a context of a developing country, that the cost of that initiative is huge. Is it realistic? Probably not. So what are we suggesting instead? And sometimes, again, this is my interpretation, and I might be embarrassed looking back on this in a few years' time, is that I think that we pursue different goals in developing countries than we do in developed countries about climate-compatible development. In the UK, we think about London. We think about protecting London, making sure that we are developing, growing, being more productive. We think about making sure we're protected against the elements. We've invested billions in our Thames Barrier 2100 to make sure we have robust decision-making in place that will allow us to continue to adapt over the years as we get more and more information in about climate change. In terms of global winners and losers, I would argue that sometimes our framing of the problems in developing countries prevent us from adopting the same strategies that we're seeing in the developed world. Are we recommending solutions like Thames Barrier 2100 for capital cities at high risk of flooding in the developing world? I'll leave that as an open question. So that's the sort of global level winners and losers. I think there are some things perhaps we need to take a step back from and reconsider when we're thinking about climate compatible development. At the local level, I still don't think that we are seeing I don't think I'm necessarily hearing about climate compatible development at the local level when we go around the room. You know, we hear about disaster risk reduction and its links with adaptation. For me, that's about adaptation. Or we think about green growth and what we need to do to deliver that at the local level. It's not this notion of all of them being delivered together. When we're not talking about investing in these individual initiatives, we're talking about bringing them all together and delivering something as a joint initiative that provides a response to all of them. And I'm just not convinced. I'm not convinced that we do understand who the winners and losers are. I'm not convinced that we have mechanisms in place to evaluate the extent of the losses. I'm not sure that we should just be trying something and taking action now and experimenting, as Tom suggested. I think, you know, if we took a step back and did what we would do for London in other places, would we take those decisions? I don't know.
One of the things that we've always argued very strongly against in CDKN is you don't want to have 3 different development plans. You know, it's already bad enough that we have a development plan, an environment plan, a food security plan, a gender plan, a discrimination plan, and now we have a climate plan as well. You need one framework, and that framework needs to take account of all those things, including climate compatibility. And it is beginning to happen in some places, I think. Claudia hasn't come in, but Pippa, would you like to say anything about, from the comments on Colombia and more generally Latin America? Can you stand up, please?
Hello, yes. Pippa Halings, and I'm working with CDKN on the Latin American and Caribbean program that we're doing, regional director there, but also a little bit looking at how we frame how we're contributing and moving towards climate-compatible development in all the programs that we're doing. On the policy and planning side, and Claudia, hola, we were in a Cartagena meeting, and after 2.5 years of working in Cartagena, I'll give a little example. The first time Claudia was working on this with her team, the private sector said, shh, don't talk about climate risk. That is so bad for investment. You know, we're not going to come to these meetings if we're going to talk about that. And we're not going to talk about vulnerability, because the vulnerability was not about the private sector, it was about the poor people displaced within Cartagena, and still 2 years later in refugee camps. Displaced by flooding. In the massive, Claudia said raining, it was lovely. If that's rain, you know, that was transforming of the Colombian economy in 2010-11. 2.5 years later, they're now framing Cartagena locally as competitiveness and resilience. So some of those within the Chamber of Commerce are saying, actually with the sun, sea and tourism, because before they were saying discount rates and this, they're saying, we're only here for 10 years. So what if it all disappears into the sea? Because we move. Sun and sea tourism moves. You know? To then be, when I was there in Colombia, within the group that now is looking at joined up, and this is what I think is that it's joined up good development thinking. Good joined up thinking that says, one, the tourism sector is now saying, actually, if we're more resilient in the way we do our planning and we bring it into the land use planning, we can actually be more competitive in the future. And we also want to actually get in on the mitigation scene, and we're going to have these better development. We're actually going to be developed country level on better buildings, you know, with all their ecological and their climate compatibility. And at the same time, we had research that was saying, what happens with these displaced communities? We're identifying where the vulnerable areas are, and they started talking about, we'll just resettle them. We'll just pick them up and we'll resettle them. And I just think, have you seen what happens when you just pick people up and resettle them? They actually go back and they become more vulnerable. They go back. And why do they go back? And actually bringing that debate, which is an adaptation and development and impact on people debate, all in the same meeting. And framing that as competitiveness and resilience in the city sector, and wanting to become a leading city in that. To me, that's why we're there. This is the lens, this is where you're moving forward, and there are opportunities, but also you're actually looking at how you mitigate some of those risks. Will that all happen in one triple win? No, there's got to be multiple strategies. But joined up good development thinking, for me, it kind of started to happen.
I blinked at the wrong moment. What did you do to convince them? These cynical, allegedly, industry leaders?
What happened was when you actually brought in good evidence base around the vulnerable areas, and they looked actually their planning, you know, and they actually knew that actually here is a binding regulatory mechanism which can stop where they're developing. If they don't get engaged in the debate, they no longer have a free-for-all about where they can build and how they can build. So they decided to engage better.
So, but left to themselves, they would have said, oh, we're out in 10 years and we'll still build the hotels where they're going to be flooded.
So I don't know if that...
Yeah, no, so regulation then.
Absolutely.
Okay, but I mean, then the question is, it's still not in their interest to do it unless they're forced to.
I think nothing is ever completely single, no. So I think there are contributing mechanisms all the time by incentives and then regulatory mechanisms to ensure that those incentives continue. Okay. But also they know that in the new market, the tourism market is about that as well.
Okay, we're talking at this point in the conversation about compensation and Pareto optimality and trade-offs. Karen wants to come in on that?
Oh, actually, I was going to come in and give you a more positive answer. Because I didn't mean to come across as very negative. You keep asking me about Obama and Cameron, but I think the opportunities in other countries are enormous. In developing countries, we've done this other study I mentioned on low carbon logic, where we went to 3 low-income countries and looked at particular sectors. And there are definitely opportunities for double wins, if not triple wins, in a number of these sectors. And the private sector is beginning to respond. And they are investing to get different sorts of energy themselves, you know, investing in waste-to-energy schemes, they're investing in solar power, mini hydro, all sorts of things, because they're desperate for energy because they can't get it from the grid. They are going to have a huge competitive advantage going forward, and they're showing some leadership in terms of innovation too.
Example?
Flower farms in Kenya are using geothermal and mini hydro and big solar, all different ones, solar panels on the roofs of their greenhouses. They're also collecting water from the roofs, which they're channeling and storing for when there's dry periods, some of which they're then supplying to the local village. So they are very much part of the solution. Companies like Unilever are developing the Cool Farm tool, which is going to assess, you know, the carbon emissions from different patterns of production of their products. Again, that will contribute to mitigation potentially going forward. In tourism, you've got hotels and tour companies who are investing in energy solutions and water solutions because they know that they can't rely on the national systems to deliver that. So they're having to develop it themselves. Again, they're building, you know, solar power plants and things like that. So there's a real opportunity, I think, in developing countries to capitalize on all this innovation and energy, and that will stand them in good stead going forward. They may well be the most competitive countries in the world going forward. You know, they've got lots of other costs going on at the moment, which is undermining that competitiveness, but there's a huge opportunity there. So I think we shouldn't be too negative. I think the problem is with the rich countries now, who are like the vested interests. They've got a lot to lose from changing their pattern of production. So tackling that is going to be challenging. For the developing countries, there's huge opportunities to gain from what's going on, and that is quite positive, I think, and we should capitalize on that and work with the private sector to find those solutions, even if for government it's often quite challenging to provide the stimulus. The private sector is doing it on their own in a lot of cases, and also lobbying government to do that. So we should capitalize on that and really work with those kinds of processes.
Just quickly on this topic, does it make a difference to the investment decisions companies are making, A, that a deal in 2015 is still a bit remote, B, that carbon pricing is difficult in Europe, and my ABC 1, 2, 3, and third, shale gas?
Yes, yeah, they're all undermining those types of developments, but I think within some of these countries there's existing drivers which are overriding that at the moment. But I think there's no doubt that if you did have a clearer trajectory towards an international mitigation policy, then that would speed things up enormously. So there's still a strong case, very strong case to do that. But even if we don't do that, things are happening, and perhaps the real solution is to do a lot more of these things unilaterally.
Very good. Sam, I can bring you in at the end. Did you say you wanted to come in now?
I'll wait till the end.
Okay, we've got another 5 minutes before I bring Sam in. Let's try and use the last 5 minutes then to think of some practical positive outcomes from this meeting. Never mind Obama in the lift, unless you want to come in on that. I mean, it's always useful to hear. But actually, having seen that there are some powerful drivers, but also some really big constraints to overcome. We've heard a bit about the need to compensate losers, about having integrated planning, about the importance of regulation to overcome market failure. What else can we bring, looking very specifically at this list of problems? And I've got 2 hands up over there and 1 here, so we'll take you 3 and see where we are.
Hello. Alison Doig from Christian Aid. And one thing I haven't heard mentioned here is the big opportunity with the post-2015 development framework. Christian Aid with Green Alliance and others have proposed, for example, that all of the goals that come out, the post-MDG goals, or Sustainable Development Goals, whatever they're going to be called, should have 4 tests. They should be tested for resource efficiency, for low carbon, for adaptation, and for DRR, for disaster resilience. So actually, we have an opportunity to build it in now. So I mean, it's a very practical way. I would also add to that it ought to look along the whole supply chain. It ought to be universal. It ought to look at our consumption, how it affects the development as well. And I think that's something that's not been considered. So any comments on that would be useful.
Thanks so much. And the person next to you, on your left.
Jakob Mulugeta at the University of Surrey. I think, and I spent, the past 2 years at the African Climate Policy Center in Ethiopia and had a fairly good peek into what is happening, for example, in Ethiopia. And one thing that strikes you is that, there are ambitious policies that are out there. You take Ethiopia as an example. You have the Growth and Transformation Plan, which is about growing the economy at 11 to 15% over the next 10 years or so. And alongside that, you have the climate resilient green economy, which is basically arguing that we will grow this economy at 15% along a carbon neutral pathway. Both of them are extremely ambitious. Both of them are uncharted territories. This is the first time a number of countries are coming up with these types of ambitious plans. One thing that I think is not actually happening is that, for example, climate compatible development, is this something which is debated and discussed within countries? Because ultimately they are the ones who are going to embrace the concept. The other issue is also how do you create the type of interactions between different types of policies, the economic policy as well as the climate policy. And I think this is the real challenge, to try and broaden the issue of climate change into the development sectors. Because right now, in my own observation, is that the climate resilient program in Ethiopia is in the hands of the EPA, the Environmental Protection Agency. Okay, it does have quite a lot of buy-in from higher up, but leadership on its own is not even enough, because you do need to have the other sectors, the other ministries deeply involved. And I think agenda setting and also ensuring that the different types of policies are interacting is something that is worth discussing.
Okay, good. Thank you very much. And the last comment over here.
Thank you. David Viner from Mont MacDonald. I've probably been working as an academic in the past for nearly 20 years on this issue around climate change, climate impact and adaptation and resilience. And we're now in a consultancy environment, working with companies, governments around the world, providing them with solutions. I see an urgent need, and many companies, and when we talk to the operations directors of many companies, are desperate for the information about how they can become more resilient. I suppose what this has reinforced, and it's more of a statement, is that there's still quite a big disconnect between the academic community talking about adaptation and resilience and disaster risk management and what's going on in the real world. And I think that's a bridge that really needs to be built. That's probably the wrong metaphor. Now that sort of relates to one of the comments from our Colombian colleague about development means building new roads. That's definitely not a climate compatible development issue. The other thing is on leadership. There has been an abject failure of political leadership, and that's driven by short-term political cycles, and we can see that. We saw with our current government coming in, very, very big talk, greenest government ever, etc. We've seen Obama to many eyes caused the failure of Copenhagen. So how we then use and develop the leadership, because that is one thing that is lacking. We saw the leadership on the Make Poverty History campaign, but we haven't seen the consolidated single point of leadership and focal point on the climate change issue. Thank you.
All right.
Just on the issue of road, there needs to be a little bit of context.
You literally one sentence, Pippa, because we are
just to put into context. I think most of you who do know Colombia, have referenced Colombia, know that actually because of what some refer to as civil war in Colombia, the whole thing is actually Colombia does not have a national network of roads. that's reliable, because they haven't been able to get into those areas to maintain the road system. So we're talking about a road system that isn't yet a basic national road network system to then. So it's not that it's increasing beyond.
I'm going to ask Sam to close the meeting, but let me just say what I've taken away, which is that it's really important for us not to be starry-eyed about climate-compatible development. I think Emma's given us a really good challenge to make sure that we're clear in the concepts and that we understand that there are losers as well as winners. But I want to celebrate and thank Karen for the work she's done, which is to identify what the practical drivers are at country level and then to tell us what the challenges are that we have to overcome. And they're not trivial challenges, actually. The costs associated with change, the interest groups, the short-termism, the lack of state capacity, the institutional challenges. But I think we've actually also had some quite optimistic stories. And I think your illustrations from Kenya, some of the ones that Natasha gave us from Senegal and Mozambique, and some of the others around the room tell us that actually there is a case. And I don't think we should dismiss short-term political cycles, because actually we live in a world in which the political cycles shape policy. And if we can't make the case politically, then we can't make the case, full stop. So one of the challenges we have as people who work at the interface of research and policy, which is certainly what CDKN does and also ODI, is to understand how that interface works and to see whether or not there is a political case to be made. I think we've made some progress today. I think there's still more to do. Sam?